The city breathes at night. Not the clean, orderly breath of morning commutes and office towers, but something deeper, a dark exhalation from the streets themselves. In Houston, Texas, this breath tastes like rust and resignation. The August heat refuses to break even after sunset. The concrete still radiates the day's punishment. Neon bleeds into the humid air, mixing with the smell of grilled meat from food trucks, diesel exhaust, and something else, something like fear, though fear doesn't have a smell. It just feels like the weight of the city pressing down on your shoulders, day after day, night after night. This is where Marcus Webb existed before the world knew his name. A radiologist at Memorial Hermann Medical Center, 43 years old, divorced, no children. He lived in a modest apartment in Montrose, paid his taxes, attended St. John's Methodist on Easter. He was invisible in the way that competent, quiet men become invisible, present but forgotten, reliable but unremarkable. His colleagues knew him as professional. His neighbors didn't know him at all. He bought his coffee at the same cafe every morning, ordered the same sandwich at the same lunch counter every other Thursday. Life was measured, predictable, safe. He had constructed a world where nothing could touch him, where distance was a form of protection, where looking away was a strategy for survival. Marcus had learned long ago that safety meant silence, safety meant looking away. Safety meant existing in the spaces between other people's suffering, never quite seeing, never quite hearing, never quite being implicated in the world's injustices. He'd perfected this art over decades. It had served him well. It had kept him comfortable. The neighborhood where he lived was changing. Property developers had begun circling the old Victorian houses like vultures, and with development came displacement. Families who had lived on those blocks for generations began disappearing, replaced by luxury condos and craft cocktail bars. The old structures were demolished. The old stories were erased. But not everything changed quickly. On 4th Street, just 3 blocks from Marcus's apartment, the old community center still stood weathered, underfunded, but still standing like an old tree refusing to fall. It was run by a woman named Diane Foster, who had been there for 22 years. She offered after-school programs for kids, job training for adults, a food pantry on Wednesdays. The city ignored it. The police avoided it. But the people who lived there depended on it like plants depend on rain, like drowning men depend on air. Marcus had walked past that community center hundreds of times. He'd never been inside. He'd seen children playing on its cracked basketball court and had looked away. He'd seen the line of people waiting for the food pantry and had increased his pace. He'd constructed his entire moral geography around avoiding that building, around maintaining his distance, around telling himself that their problems were not his responsibility. On a Tuesday evening in September, returning home from the hospital around 9 p.m., Marcus witnessed something that would shatter every carefully constructed boundary he'd built. A young man, couldn't have been more than 17, was being forced into the back of a truck by 3 men wearing the kind of casual violence that comes from years of practice. The boy was fighting, his voice small and desperate against the street noise. Marcus saw the moment the boy's head struck the truck's frame. He saw the blood, dark and sudden. He saw the truck disappear down a side street toward the warehouse district. Marcus stood alone on the sidewalk. His hands trembled. His instinct was immediate and practiced. He turned away. He increased his pace. He walked home as if nothing had happened. He closed his door. He poured himself bourbon. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility. The police handled these things. Or they didn't. Either way, it wasn't his concern. He was just one man. What could he do? What could anyone do? He was wrong, though he wouldn't understand how wrong until much later. The boy's name was Devin Harris, no relation to the doctor, and he was found 3 days later, barely breathing, in an abandoned warehouse near the shipping channel. 14 stab wounds, massive internal bleeding, brain damage. The police filed a report with minimal detail. There was no visible investigation. Devin died on a Thursday morning without regaining consciousness, with his mother holding his hand and asking the nurses why her son's case wasn't being treated as a priority case. The nurses looked away, the way Marcus had looked away that September night. The hospital staff processed his death as a routine loss. Another young man from a poor neighborhood, another statistic, another case that would be filed away and forgotten. Diane Foster knew Devon. He'd been coming to the community center since he was 12 years old, playing basketball, eating free lunches, learning about college pathways that seemed impossibly distant, impossibly expensive, impossibly out of reach. She said a prayer for him at the center. She organized a candlelit vigil. 40 people attended. The local news sent no cameras. The police sent no detectives. The city sent no flowers, no resources, no acknowledgement that a life had ended and that something might be done about it. 2 weeks later, another boy disappeared from the same neighborhood. Then a girl. Then a third boy. 4 young people in 2 months, all from the same zip code, all connected to the community center, all belonging to families, without the resources to hire lawyers or make noise in the right rooms. The pattern was invisible to anyone not looking. The pattern was impossible to ignore if you were actually looking, if you were willing to see. Marcus began looking. He didn't plan to. It started as obsession masquerading as concern. He printed articles about disappearances from his hospital office. He created a file on his personal computer. He began recognizing names. He started tracking dates and locations. But he still told himself he was just a concerned citizen gathering information. He wasn't investigating. He wasn't involved. He was simply aware now. And awareness, he learned, was its own kind of burden, a weight that pressed against him every moment of every day. Then he made the connection that changed everything. Among the detectives assigned to the missing persons cases was a man named Lieutenant Charles Brennan, a 15-year veteran of the Houston Police Department, with a decorated record and connections that reached into the mayor's office. Brennan had a reputation. He was efficient, connected, useful to people who needed things handled quietly and completely. He was also, according to 3 separate sources Marcus found online, under investigation by Internal Affairs for serious misconduct. The investigation had been ongoing for 8 months and had somehow disappeared from public record, sealed away in filing cabinets and password-protected databases. The cases against Brennan's son, a petty theft conviction, a drug possession charge, various assault allegations, had also seemed to have vanished from the database, though Marcus could find fragments of the original filings online, cached pages that shouldn't have existed. The 4 missing young people had been reported to Brennan's precinct. They had been assigned to Brennan's division. Their cases had been deprioritized, then shelved, then forgotten. The connections were circumstantial, but they formed a pattern. The pattern formed a picture. The picture was one of deliberate negligence, systematic indifference, institutional corruption. Marcus didn't confront Brennan. He didn't call the police or the FBI or any official agency. He understood now that the system protected its own, that going through channels meant disappearing into those same systems. Instead, he did something that surprised him with its clarity. He walked into the community center on a Friday evening and asked to speak with Diane Foster. She was smaller than he'd expected, with gray threading through her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much loss to be surprised by anything anymore. When Marcus told her what he'd found, she cried. Not the dramatic tears of performance, but the quiet weeping of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed. She asked him what they should do. Marcus didn't have an answer, not yet, but answers began to form in the following weeks, in the form of a photograph. Marcus attended a crime prevention meeting at City Hall, where Brennan was present, standing among 3 city councilmen, all of them smiling, all of them comfortable, all of them radiating the ease of men who knew nothing would touch them. Marcus took a photograph from his phone. He printed it. He captioned it carefully with the names and case numbers of the 4 missing young people. He placed these photographs on telephone poles throughout the neighborhood, on the walls of the community center, on the windshields of cars parked near the police precinct where Brennan worked. There was no violence in the photographs. There was no threat. There was only a question, simple and direct. Why are these children missing, and why is nothing being done? The response was immediate and crushing. The city removed the posters within hours. Brennan's department issued a statement denying any connection between the lieutenant and the missing persons cases. The city attorney's office sent cease and desist letters to anyone they suspected. The media, which had ignored the disappearances, suddenly had coverage to produce, though not the kind that helped. Vigilante campaign targets respected detective. The headlines read, "Misinformation campaign against police." Unknown activist spreads unfounded accusations, but something shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then with gathering force. Community members began asking questions they hadn't asked before. People started showing up at city council meetings, demanding answers, demanding investigations, demanding that their children be treated as valuable. A local journalist named Rebecca Santos, someone who had been looking at these cases independently for months, was suddenly given permission by her editor to pursue a full investigation. The photographs had done something that official channels couldn't. They had made the invisible visible. They had turned silence into noise. Within 3 months, the investigation into Lieutenant Brennan's conduct expanded dramatically. The Internal Affairs file was unsealed under pressure from the State Attorney General's office. Evidence emerged of a connection between Brennan and a trafficking ring operating in the Warehouse District, a connection that had been deliberately buried by his superior. Not because they were involved, necessarily, but because investigation meant accountability, and accountability meant scrutiny of the entire system. The city preferred to let it rest, to let it fade away into darkness, but the city's preference was no longer available. Rebecca Santos's investigative piece, a 20,000-word examination of institutional negligence and systemic corruption, won a regional journalism award. The state attorney general opened a formal investigation. Brennan was arrested on corruption charges and conspiracy. The trafficking network was dismantled through coordinated police and federal action. Slowly, painfully slowly, resources were directed toward solving the disappearances of Devin Harris and the 3 others. Not all questions were answered, not all wounds were healed, but the silence was broken. The pattern was exposed. Pause and reflect when justice stops at the gates. Who dares to cross? Through all of this, Marcus remained anonymous. He was never connected to the photographs. He never spoke to the media. He never accepted credit. He never sought recognition or redemption, but something had changed inside him. Not healing, exactly, but a kind of opening. The life he'd constructed around invisibility had cracked, and he couldn't rebuild it the same way. He tried, in those first months after Brennan's arrest, to return to his old patterns, but the patterns no longer fit. The old strategies of distance and indifference felt like lies now, and he could no longer live inside them. He began volunteering at the community center on Thursday evenings. He spent those hours helping kids with algebra homework, listening to their stories, being present in a way he'd never been present before. He sat with Keisha Harris, Devin's mother, and let her talk about her son without looking away. He ate lunch with Diane Foster and listened to her dreams for expanding the center's programs. He was visible now, not in a dramatic way, not seeking attention or gratitude, but in the small, persistent way that matters to people who needed someone to see them, to acknowledge them, to confirm that they existed, and that their lives mattered. A young man named Anthony, 17 years old, Devin's cousin, someone who had been heading down the same trajectory, came to the community center in Marcus's second year of volunteering there. Anthony had been surrounded by the signs: poverty, abandoned schools, police indifference, no visible future, no one telling him he mattered. But he found Marcus one afternoon and asked him something simple and profound: "Why do you care?" Marcus didn't have a rehearsed answer. He thought about the night he'd seen Devin being forced into the truck. He thought about the years he'd spent looking away from the city's pain, because it wasn't his pain, because he'd convinced himself that distance was freedom. He thought about the moment when he realized that everyone's pain is everyone's pain, that we are all implicated in each other's suffering, and that looking away was a choice, and that choice had consequences that echoed through communities and generations. Because someone needed to, Marcus told him, and no one was going to do it but me. Anthony is in college now, studying criminal justice. He's working on a project about institutional negligence in missing persons cases, about how systems fail young people from poor neighborhoods, about how accountability doesn't come from above, but from people who refuse to accept injustice. He says he's going to become the kind of detective who doesn't look away. If this story made you think, subscribe. More untold truths await. For what begins as one person's silence can become a whole city's complicity, and it takes just one person deciding to see, to speak, to act, to change the momentum of injustice. The warehouse district still exists. The heat still refuses to break in August. The city still breathes its dark exhalation every night. But Devin Harris's case is solved. His death led to convictions. The 4 missing young people are remembered. The community center still stands, and now it has resources it didn't have before. Diane Foster still runs it, and her waiting list has grown longer. The system didn't change. Systems rarely do, fully and finally. But the fault lines appeared. The cracks showed where pressure could be applied. Marcus Webb goes to work at Memorial Hermann Medical Center every day. He still reads X-rays with precision and care. He still lives in the same apartment in Montrose. He still orders the same sandwich on Thursday afternoon. But he's no longer invisible, and invisibility, once lost, can't be reclaimed. The people at the community center know his name now. They know where to find him. They know that when something happens, when something breaks, Marcus Webb is someone who will look, who will see, who will act. The photograph of Lieutenant Brennan and the city councilman still exists somewhere on the internet. People share it sometimes, with the caption, "This is what accountability looks like." But they don't know that Marcus took that photograph. They don't know his name. They don't know that it began with a choice not to look away, with a decision to break the silence that had protected both the guilty and the complicit. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the stories that matter most aren't about individual heroism or dramatic confrontations. Maybe they're about the moment when a whole community decides together that silence is no longer acceptable, that the cost of complicity is too high to bear. Maybe they're about the radiologist who finally looked, who finally let himself see what he'd been pretending not to see. Maybe they're about all of us, deciding whether we'll look away or look toward the light, whether we'll maintain our comfortable distance or step into the painful, necessary work of actual justice. You're watching Urban Justice Noir. The truth is still burning under the city lights, and the question remains, the same question it always was, the same question it always will be. What will you do when you see it?